Um, so we'll now record. Welcome, everybody. I'm Duncan Bowie. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Socialist Society. This is one of our regular, normally monthly talks. So we're very pleased to have Kevin Morgan, who is well known to many of us, and a long-term member of the SHS, who's going to speak on Aimé Césaire and Martinique. Can I just ask everybody to mute while Kevin is speaking? He's going to speak and he's got some slides for somewhere between kind of 35 and 45 minutes probably. And then we've got lots of time for questions. The sessions normally go on for about an hour and a half in total, but we'll see how the questions go. Please don't put questions in Q&A while Kevin's speaking because it can be a bit distracting for him as the speaker. So welcome, Kevin. Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Duncan, and the Society for having me. And I'm just going to try and get my slideshow going. And there we are. So just to avoid looking at my talking head for the next half hour or 40 minutes. So yes, going to talk about Aimé Césaire and Martinique. And the thing I should say at the start, which I think some of you at least already know, is that I'm not a specialist in Césaire studies, which is almost like a field in itself, or Martinique, or really Black Atlantic or Black history. So it's quite a specific line of approach I'm going to bring to Césaire and how I came across Césaire, which is really as a historian of communism. And which is as we'll see in a minute, it's a relatively unusual route for coming across Césaire. But I picked up on Césaire as somebody who left the Communist Party in 1956, as I'm sure many people know in France, but couldn't really find out very much about how he came to join or what he did when he was in it. So I got interested in Césaire through this moment of 1956, which I'll be talking quite a bit about today. But there was no sort of personal history behind that I could easily find. And so that's really the main theme I'm going to be talking about today. First of all, say a little bit about Césaire and Césaire's politics and how that's been discussed in this huge literature there it now is about Césaire. Secondly, I'll say just a little bit about the break with the PCF, the French Communist Party, in 1956. And then I want to open it up to the other characters in Martinican communism, which, to be honest, a year or two ago, I didn't even know really existed. It was as if the history of Martinican communism started and finished with Césaire. And I've now found out that isn't the case, and that there are some of these almost lost histories or unacknowledged histories that one could also think about. So I'll say a little bit about that as well at the end. I've started the I've been using. I'll mention in a moment some of the key accounts of Césaire and his politics and Martinique and communism I've used, and also I've not been to Martinique into the archives there, but there's obviously digitized materials you can use, like the Martinican Party Weekly, Justice. You can see an example of that in front of you, and that's the particular issue from when Césaire was elected as a deputy to the French National Assembly, because Martinique, as a colony in the process of becoming a department, was going to be electing Césaire to the National Assembly, actually until after the collapse of the Soviet Union into the 1990s, he was a deputy. So I sort of knew a bit about that. But what I actually, when I first got into this subject, didn't even know about was that there was another deputy elected as a communist in Martinique, Leopold Bissol. You can see him there. He was actually a party veteran, a worker by trade. He was sort of one of the founders of communism in Martinique back in the 1930s. Well, I knew nothing about Bissol, and it's not even that easy to find out about him now. So, as I say, part of what I'm doing today is to think about Césaire and the questions that he raises, but also to bring, I shan't say much about Bissol, or if I want to say anything else really about Bissol, I don't think today, but to bring in some of these other characters that I think are also of interest. So, yeah, this is how I first came across him. And I suspect if you know about Césaire and communism, this is the text that you will probably also know, the letter to Maurice Thorez that he wrote in October 1956, just before the second Soviet intervention in Hungary. Um, and I mean, Césaire, he was a member of the French Communist Party. Um, because there was a sort of Martinique confederation of the PCF. Perhaps come into that a little bit later. But so Torres was his party leader, his general secretary, and he wrote this. Well, it's really a fantastic piece of writing if you read it, his letter to Torres. In the France Observateur was a sort of new leftish type of French weekly. Um, Political weekly at that time, and it was issued as a pamphlet in French and very quickly afterwards in English as well by Présence Africaine. And this particular phrase, what I demand of Marxism and communism is that they serve the black peoples, not that the black people serve Marxism and communism. Please accept my resignation from the party. I suppose amongst political historians, they might be the best known words that Césaire ever wrote. I came across them, I think, first in maybe David Coates' little Fontana Modern Masters book on Frantz Fanon, and then that particular translation. There's different translations I picked up today from Cedric J. Robinson's book on Black Marxism. It's a much quoted um, phrase. So, in a sense, that's the document we all know, the document of somebody leaving a party, but we almost don't know how they came to be in that party. And when I say, you know, we might not sat here today, or I might not have as a researcher getting into it, but as I say, there's this huge literature on Césaire, and you'll find this document cited in many, many accounts. But they play down his attachment to the PCF and Césaire himself, really. There's no personal papers, it appears, of Césaire's that he kept. And when he talked about it, his attachment, it is almost as he drifted in there. He didn't, things that he wrote as a communist didn't necessarily appear in his collected writings, like the cult poem he wrote addressed to Maurice Thorez and things like that. Um, so, um, so that was those were the questions I was interested, not as a Césaire specialist, but just as a historian of communism, into looking at a bit more closely. So there, if you don't know much about Césaire, that's just a little potted career summary. Um, Born and educated in Martinique at the Lycée Chauchet, where he later taught during the war years. He is the second there in Paris. He goes to Paris in 1932, where the anti-imperialist metropolis that we can read about, all these networks by which he's radicalized. I think you could say he was radicalized more than politicized in the 1930s. There's some suggestion that he joins the Jeunesse Communiste at that time. He claims to have done so when he writes a PCF party autobiography in the late 40s. But his biographers suggest there's not much other evidence for that. But he is certainly radicalized. And Léon Damas and Leopold Senghor, they're like almost like this sort of troika that's identified with the ideas and movements of negritude as a sort of cultural literary critique of colonialism emerging at that time. Um, and yeah, Césaire, his notebook of my native land, Cahiers de Retour au Pays Natal, in its first iteration, published in 1935, probably his most famous poem. But we're interested in Martinique this evening. He returned to Martinique in 1939. And he publishes this cultural review, which is a very interest in itself in the sort of Vichy period. Again, it's more of a cultural resistance or cultural critique in the circumstances of the time, but it's a very interesting periodical. Suzanne Césaire, his wife, is involved with it. But also, I mention these, flag up these names now, René Ménil and Georges Gratillon, because they'll both be long-standing communists. We'll see Ménil. I'll come to him later on because he becomes quite bitter about Césaire after he leaves in 1956 and the circumstances in which he breaks with communism. And then he's elected as a deputy, as I've said, in 1945, mayor of Fort-de-France, the sort of capital of Martinique. And I know it's been flagged up. This will come up as a question. So he is a key player in the departmentalization of former colonies, the old colonies within the renewed French Union, i.e. the renewed French Union of the Fourth Republic. So he favors departmentalization, which I suppose critics could regard as a form of assimilation, as opposed to independence. So there's a question that might come up in discussion as to why he does that. I suppose if I was to anticipate that question, why he does at that period, it's part and parcel of his identity as a communist. I mean, it's totally I think he functions as a more orthodox communist than is often perhaps suggested. And that is that, that's part of the PCF's commitment to this renewed republican ideal as expressed in the Fourth Republic at that time. I just mentioned the Discours sur le colonialisme, the Discourse on colonialism, published in 1950. That's possibly his most famous political writing, a really fantastic, searing indictment of colonialism. And that's easily available in English, but sometimes forgotten that he writes and publishes that as a communist. It's got an epigraph by Jacques Duclos. As I say, he's much more of a communist, I think, than he himself would have us believe. Breaks in 1956. I'll be talking about that, and forms a year or two later. I don't think he's got a very clear, considered plan for that break. We'll come to that in a moment. But a year or two later, he forms the party Progressiste Martinique, and he remains this strange figure. He's this great writer and anti-colonialist thinker, and at the same time is a political figure in Martinique. And particularly critics from within Martinique say there's quite a mismatch between the two. And that, that he's much more radical. We're just talking about this briefly beforehand, but, if he's turning up to the Cultural Congress in Havana, and he's in those sorts of exchanges, one gets a much more radical impression of Césaire than evidently people necessarily do in Martinique itself. Okay, there's a huge, as I say, well, if you're just getting into the topic like myself, a really daunting literature on Césaire, as a brilliant writer, as a playwright, because of the links with negritude and so on. Far less on his politics. But that has changed in recent years. One of the reasons I'm able to give this talk now is because of these sources and accounts that exist. The sources include the digitized press sources that I draw on to an extent, and things like autobiographies. But there's also material one can access in French, not much in English, but in French on Césaire's politics. So Of those items, the one on the right is a really fantastic biography by Cora Veron. It's like, I would imagine, would have to be the definitive biography to somebody who's really seems to have uncovered every trace you could with regard to Césaire. So there is a very, that's only published a year or two ago, a very good biography. Um, there's the second from the left there, the Écrits politiques. So there's a collection of his political writings that appeared not too many years ago, specifically to address this, this apparent lack of interest and recognition of his political role. So they're general accounts, but it's the other two accounts as well that, in a sense, I'd like to maybe to make the connections between them. So on the left, you can see there's this book David Alliot on communism is the order of the day, but it's specifically on Césaire and the PCF. Virtually nothing about Martinique in there. Remember, it's in Martinique that there's the party workers who are, they're doing the work that's getting Césaire into the assembly, his local political base. That's not in that book at all. Um, but there is that you can see the fourth book there, the second from the right. This book by, if you can read it, it's Bosfor is the author, and that's just like, I suppose, a sort of social and political history, including the histories from below, the social biography, the using the interviews of communism in Martinique, on which I've drawn a lot, and then leads that you can try and follow up. So it's to try and put together maybe what you can find from some of these accounts, and it's suggested some of the questions. That I've got as many questions as answers I should mention this evening, but there's some of the questions that I've been interested in exploring over the um, past few months in looking at Césaire. So, as I say, two questions I want to look at. What caused Césaire to break with the PCF in 1956? And thinking about that will take us back a little bit into the nature of his relationship with the Communist Party. And then how did this play out with the communists in Martinique, who, as I say, they include some of his closest political associates and some of the people who you'd think might have been the first that he would have taken counsel with if he was breaking with the party in 1956. But as we'll see, that wasn't the case at all. Okay, first of all, why did he leave in October 56, as signalled by this letter to Thorez? There are two key documents. One is the letter to Thorez, and there also, after it's a delay of about 3 weeks before he gets to go back to Martinique, but then he addresses there's a tumultuous reception for him, and he addressed a great rally at the Maison du Sport there, and gives a long address accounting for his break with communism, which he knows by this time is not just the break with French communism, but with Martinican communism, because they've expelled him. And he gives a long account of what's caused him to make this break. Interesting thing about that speech is, whereas if you look at the letter to Thorez, and certainly if you look at his other writings, one would put it in terms of the repudiation of colonialism in all sorts of different senses. Obviously, the repudiation of Western colonialism, but this sort of colonialist mentality of the PCF itself. He refers to the fraternalism, by which he means the way that the communists in Paris deal with the party and himself as a representative of that party in Martinique. And then also a sort of slightly colonialist relationship, the same big brotherlyism, is how they translate it at the time, between the Soviet Union and the Eastern Europe and the world communist movement. So there's all that. There's a strong anti-colonialist emphasis there. When he gets to the Maison du Sport 3 weeks later, it's quite an interesting speech, because he hardly refers to colonialism. I don't think he refers to Africa, hardly refers to the Algerian War at all. and he gives a sort of standard, what almost, any French communist might have given the same sort of rationale. There are other French communist intellectuals who did break at that time, and they could have used much the same sort of set of arguments. So, just in terms of the images there, why would you leave in 56? The Khrushchev speech, obviously, at the 20th Congress of the CPSU at the start, that would be the start of the crisis, and it's exactly how at that speech at the Maison du Sport he does describe the start of the crisis. Then he takes you through. That's an image of Poland. I hope that down below Khrushchev there, but you've got the Polish October, events in Hungary, the crisis in European communism. He's got a lot to say about the terror in the USSR, the experience of Stalinism, and then the crisis of European communism. And then, of course, you've got the war in Algeria, the specifically French dimension. And he does refer in his letter to Thorez, he does refer briefly to Algeria, because remember, or if you don't know, the French Communist Party has supported Guy Mollet in the voting for use of emergency powers in Algeria at the start of the year. So that might have been a pretext, or not a pretext, a reason, I beg your pardon. But the interesting thing about Césaire is, over the course of 1956, until you see that letter that's published on 25th of October, he doesn't dissent from the voting for special powers in Algeria. And after all, he's a deputy, he's in a position to. In fact, he never has very much to say about the Algerian war, which is interesting, I think, in itself. In Martinique, the Martinican Party Congress had been earlier that year. He's in full support of the strategy it adopts. He's been part of the Martinican delegation to the French Party's National Congress at Le Havre in July 1956. There's a platform. It would have taken a lot of political courage to use that platform, but there's a platform, if you like. But Césaire doesn't use it at all. He's there he's there with his co-delegates as 3 Martinican delegates. He doesn't share any misgivings with them, and that's only in July. And then, as late as September, barely 3 weeks before he publishes the letter to Thorez, he actually has a sort of personal audience with Thorez and doesn't give any indication of the concerns, anxieties, differences that he has. Now, it's if you look back, if somebody breaks with the movement, especially as they do it as publicly and definitively as Césaire breaks with the French Communist Party, then you can always find the reasons that led up to that. And you can certainly see that with Césaire in 1955, as he publishes things through Présence Africaine, and he's beginning to take advantage of the greater license that you've perhaps got after the death of Stalin. But I'd say, before he publishes that letter, if you think of Picasso, who's got into far bigger controversies with the French party, I think you would have, if you didn't know what was coming, you would have thought it much more likely that Picasso would have been the one to have left than Césaire. So there's a question of why did he make that break? So I'm just going to offer some thoughts on that before I come to something on some of the other Martinican communists. Cora Véron, in this, what I said is his really good, brilliant biography, really, of Césaire. I mean, she's she's read as much as I think as you can possibly find on the subject. She's slightly wrestling with the same issue. Why the break at this particular time? And she identifies possibly his links with the communist poet, some of you may know as a former Dadaist, Tristan Tzara, Romanian, but he's been to Hungary, and there's a sort of there are the differences between Tzara and the party leadership in France at that particular moment that are publicised in Le Monde. So that could be it, but there's no real evidence that she's found that they were in correspondence about it. So these are just my thoughts on what might give a context for what as I say, it seems this rather sudden break that comes out of the blue. First International Congress of Black Writers and Artists is held in Paris, 19th to 22nd of September, so very much at this time. And there's nothing, Césaire's participation, it's obviously it's not communist and it's not communist controlled, but and in fact there's a fairly minimal communist or pro-communist presence there. But Césaire's participation is approved and subsequently publicised by the PCF. And there's nothing that he says there would indicate overt political differences. That, by the way, down in the corner, that poster, it essentially shows that it was legit as far as the PCF was concerned, because it's got the images from from Picasso and the text is taken from Césaire. So that's the meeting. This Congress, I'm sure many of you will know about at the Sorbonne in September. Césaire speaks on culture and colonization, but nothing there to specifically to indicate political dissent. But my my sense is that is as likely to be the trigger for this break as anything. If these things are sort of welling up inside him, but why the break at this moment? And I would offer three possible reasons for that. One is also being to this French National Congress, also 3 or 4 days at Le Havre. And you could just imagine what it must be for a like of, someone of Césaire's intellect to be sat through 3 or 4 days of these dreary hierarchical pseudo discussions where every issue of this really tumultuous political year is just avoided, basically. And he did at the previous PCF Congress, he had spoken it in 1954. He makes no intervention at all. But he must have sensed perhaps the contrast with the freedom that he has at the Paris Congress. Really, this talk he gives just is sort of, it ranges widely over different intellectual influences and so on in the way that Césaire could. He's sharing the platform and not just deferring to it. And there are authentic debates, which on the day that he speaks carry on till nearly midnight. So it's like a totally different type of environment to be in. So I think that could have been one trigger, particularly if one makes another connection. And one of the people that he encounters there is Richard Wright, who obviously that's Richard Wright on the right there, I should say, and Césaire on the left at that Congress. But Wright, Wright has been in Paris, so American novelist and a poet. I mean, he wrote at least one poem which Césaire translated or had his name on the translation of in the 1930s. But Wright had broken with the American Communist Party in the early 1940s. He had told the story of that break, which was used in The God That Failed, this like famous anti-communist symposium that was published at the height of the Cold War. And I think Césaire, it appears, had they'd not had much to do with each other in the intervening period. And Césaire, he'd been a supporter of Présence Africaine, on which the communists looked very warily, in a rather hostile fashion. He'd been associated with it since the 1940s, but not in an active way till 1955. Well, he's active now, as you can see from that photograph. And I think, right, he'd got dragged into God That Failed. He'd not really gone into stock anti-communist positions, but he'd managed to navigate for himself an independent force as a critical black intellectual, whose latest book, you can see that on the right there. I think it was published first in French and then in its French translation, then in English. The Colour Curtain was about the Bandung Conference the previous year. And the Black Writers and Artists Congress, in a sense, was, it was a direct follow-up to Bandung and organising the Bandung spirit. And And we know that Alioune Diop of Présence Africaine arranged a meeting between Césaire and Wright, which I think was possibly the first, serious meeting they'd had um, directly after the Congress. But unfortunately, we have no record of that meeting. I was just having a look at Wright's papers. I've just returned from the USA where they are. And there's just one little note where he talks. It's not even precisely dated, but just after the Congress, he talks about Césaire's position is changing. Black nationalism was draining off red sentiment, which is what I've used as the heading there. Um, and so I think there's like a role that you can play as a critical black intellectual drawing on Marxism that Wright is able to play outside of party ties better than Césaire has been able to. And just a third reason um, is that is that private audience that he's had with Thorez that I mentioned. Because Thorez, obviously, there's been this great cult of Thorez's leadership in the French Communist Party, and he's obviously meant to be bestowing a mark of favor on Césaire. But Thorez, by this time, he doesn't live in Paris. He's almost like living at Versailles or something. He's in a converted farmhouse 50 miles from Paris. Um, and Césaire is sort of summoned out to have this audience with him and then must drive back through the French countryside. And I just wonder, he's the only one of the, he's made one of the key addresses at this Congress, but he is the only one who is then having to go and account to himself to essentially a white European party leader. And so there's that language of fraternalism, big brotherlyism that you get in the letter to Thorez. But also, it might, not everybody, when they leave a party, do that in the form of a letter personally addressed to the General Secretary. And it might help make some sense of that. Um, so that's in a sense speculative. It's like circumstantial. We don't exactly know. But he breaks at that point. It's come out of the blue. And I just want to perhaps come for the final 10 minutes or so. I'll try not to go too long over that. Is how does that go down in Martinique? Because we know about the letter to Thorez, and if you read books about French Communist Party and its intellectuals, Césaire is always there in pride of place. But he hasn't. There's the reaction of Justice. You've seen a copy of Justice. There's Justice after Césaire resigns from the party. He hasn't confided in anybody within the Martinican, among his Martinican comrades, as far as one can tell, including those that are in Paris. He hasn't said anything to his co-delegates at the Le Havre Congress. There's an interesting contrast in my mind. In 1958, when de Gaulle is trying to drum up support for his new Fifth Republic, André Malraux goes to assist with that to Martinique, and Césaire is on the first plane home to greet him. But when he resigns from the PCF in 1956, the first you're going to hear about it as a Martinican communist is through the Paris media. It's a bit like, they've got used to it as communists because God is the Khrushchev speech. God, it's something else coming out of Moscow. You're always hearing about things and having to work your way around that because you don't really know what the story is. It's happening with Césaire's resignation. As far as we can tell, he doesn't confide with his the communists in Martinique at all, and they. Perhaps we can go into that discussion. Is that reasonably or not? They're presented with a fait accompli and respond with their own fait accompli, which is to expel him, which he apparently, it seems, had not anticipated, though it seems quite predictable. But he seems to have taken this whole process seems to have taken place rather quickly. So there's the But this is obviously a real crisis there for the Martinican communists. Martinican communists more united than ever, says that headline there. Well, that obviously it turns out not to be the case. I mean, the one reason why we perhaps tend to, if we don't know much about it, identify the Martinican communism with Césaire himself is it has a devastating results. Césaire's defection on the party in Martinique. And one can't understate how strong a position they've been in, because at the start of 1956, they're getting about 60% of the popular vote in Martinique. There's a membership density of the party in Martinique is, I think, as far as I can see, it's equal to that of anywhere in metropolitan France, the sort of various red belt areas and so on. And as an immediate and direct consequence of Césaire's defection, they lose more than half of the membership, lose both the representatives in the National Assembly, obviously Césaire, but also Bissol, and they're never again represented there. So this is like this, this is, to say the least, a watershed moment for the party in Martinique. But, and this is just the other side of the story that I want to finish with the last few minutes. The party doesn't really disintegrate. In fact, amongst those the best known figures that one can identify, there's a certain solidity about it. They don't go with Césaire. I was thinking about this as I was doing these slides today, and I was thinking of anybody who knows the essays Ralph Samuel wrote on British communism in the 1980s. One of them's called Staying Power, and I think Ralph has this sort of, he's got this sneaking sympathy for this staying power of the British communists. Well, there's a sort of staying power of these Martinican communists. So they're a federation of the PCF at this point, but reconstitute themselves an independent Martinican Communist Party in the autumn of 1957. They anticipate Césaire in committing to a goal of autonomy. So in terms of that question that might or might not come up in questions, it falls short of independence. But it's a sort of ideal of autonomy sometimes within notions of a federal France. Césaire, he uses language, talks in terms of like self-management, autogestion, and so on, but something in between, something that not the old departmentalization, it has come to mean a sort of form of assimilation, but autonomy. So they've got a program based on autonomy, and they retain significant local electoral bases. So Césaire has an absolute stronghold in Fort-de-France, and it remains so until he retires from politics. But elsewhere in Martinique, there are these communist strongholds, and they remain communist strongholds. And so, as I've talked about Césaire for such a long time, I thought I would just try and illustrate that just through four individuals. In some cases, I don't, or at least one case, I don't know that much about them myself, but these other histories that sort of get overshadowed by us always thinking about Césaire. And I think that, to my mind, raise interesting questions about Martinican communism, perhaps about communist and political movements more generally. So the first, if anybody knows, so these are all people I've sort of found out, apart with one exception, really about in the last few months. Gilbert Gratien is interesting because he was a former teacher of Césaire's at the Lycée Chaucher, and he's one of those who had been swept along with Césaire into the communist movement in the 1940s. He was also a poet. Even with my French, I can tell he's not as good a poet as Césaire, but he was also a poet seen with a sort of rather romantic notion of créolité, and in that sense, he's seen as something of a as a sort of forerunner of later trends. And as you can see, that book that I've illustrated there, this federated, a federated French Martinique, that's something he publishes as a communist in 1961. And the interesting thing about it is it's remarkably similar to what basically Césaire demands when he launches his own party, the Parti Progressiste Martinique, 2 or 3 years earlier. And there's a sort of paradox there, because actually, in terms of the policy issues, there's not that much divides the communists from Césaire, except they are more radical. Basically, critics within Martinique say, well, Césaire's party, they never get victimized. There's no prosecutions brought against them, and so on. That isn't the case with the communists. But nevertheless, politically, their strategy is not so very different. And they do try, and therefore they're both losing from this division between the PPM and the Martinican communists, and they try and repair it in certain ways. One of the reasons that make it difficult is there's so much bitterness coming out of this split in '56. So that little item at the bottom there, Le cas Césaire ou le coup Césaire, is a piece that Gratien immediately writes in Justice, repudiating his former pupil and accusing him, as we'll see others do at the same time. They see it as a sort of cult of personality. Everyone's talking about the cult of individual in 1956. And then Césaire comes back with huge crowds that he addresses as huge crowds. They're almost the great orator acclaiming his public. And Bernard Poudard, the very fine historian of French communism, says that for the orthodox communists in France, they've got a symbolic hole where personality had used to be, and they fill it with the collective, the idea of the collective. Well, Césaire fills it probably, or certainly as far as Gratian is concerned, with Césaire himself as quite a personalized form of charismatic leadership. And anyway, Gratian feels betrayed and expresses that with some bitterness. There's somebody who's been very close to Césaire. Here's another one who has been very close to Césaire, and Armand Nicolas, who, if any of these people I'm talking about today, had they been in this country, would have been a long-standing member of the Socialist History Society, it would have been Nicolas, because he's a teacher by profession. He's the general secretary for many years of the Martinican Communist Party, and he's an avid researcher into Martinican history. And you can see the two titles there. He writes a 3-volume history of Martinique. Sorry, it's so blurry. That image is all I could find there in the middle. But also that item on the right, which I think is particularly interesting and casts a light in a way on Césaire himself, because it's Nicolas who there's what you could call the Victor Schœlcher narrative of the abolition of slavery in France. And that is the great Republican Schœlcher, who is venerated by the French communists and venerated by Césaire while he is a communist. He moves the act which emancipates the slaves with the formation of the Second Republic in 1848. So that's the narrative of Schœlcher, and it proceeds from the centre outwards. Schœlcher, in my view, is a very fine radical. He went into exile under the Second Empire, but nevertheless, he then is used in this sort of white saviour model. His statue gets toppled in Martinique recently, and so on. As I say, Césaire is a great supporter of Schœlcher as a communist. What Nicolas does with this, I think its research is going back to the late 40s, but he dates the emancipation of the slaves in Martinique from the slave revolt that predates the news of that decree coming from France. So the two things are going on at the same time, but they don't know of this decree. And so slavery is abolished in Martinique before receipt of the decree from France. And that's eventually picked up in Martinique, and the public holiday becomes the day of, I think it's 22nd of May, of the slave revolt in Martinique itself. Well, it's Armand Nicolas, amongst his many historical researches, who discovers that. Interesting comparison with Césaire, because I'm interested. The reason I got interested in Césaire is I'm thinking about how communists and those who come through communist movement write their alternative histories. And how does Césaire do it? He writes about Chaucer, and when he moves on from that Republican narrative, he he writes a book about Toussaint Louverture, just mentioned just before we started. It's just appeared in an English edition. So he moves to Haiti, but he doesn't write from this Martinican perspective. Nicolas does. And sorry, I should have said about Nicolas. He, it's this Lycée Chaucher. He, and again to anticipate this question, like Fanon and also Edouard Glissant, um, has been a student of the at the Lycée Chaucher. Um, but Nicolas is like a protege of Césaire's in the 1940s as well. And in fact, he collaborates in Tropique as a very young man then. So there's another figure I think it's interesting to know more about. I mentioned this one. I know very little about Georges Duval, um, except that he's a communist mayor of Saint-Esprit in Martinique from 1947, also a teacher. Later writes the first school history from a Martinican perspective, so you could link with Nicolas in that way. He's been a co-delegate with Césaire to the Le Havre Party Congress in July 1956, the Congress of the PCF. So he's another of those figures that maybe Césaire could have confided with, but didn't. But I just flag him up for two reasons, really. This is Le Progressiste then, so this is the paper of Césaire's own party, because it is really his vehicle, as far as I can see, from 1958. And I get easily shocked, I suppose, but I found it a bit shocking because you can see there that Césaire is the editor of this paper, but this describes how the Duval in Saint Esprit denies Césaire's supporters use of the schoolhouse for a rally, and after the rally, which is treated, it's described in quite cultish terms of this, delirious reception. Um, you can see if you read French, you see in the little cutting of there, every minute of the speech was worth the pain of living, worth living for. But the 300 of them wearing the party colours go round Fit Duval's house and indicate their disapproval until late into the night. And if you read the communist account of the same events, they describe gunshots being fired and so on. So there is, I'll come to there's a context for what I'll come to the last of these four people in a second. But some of the politics that Césaire's, he's not involved with that, but it's not the most attractive of political movements. And when he's accused, as we'll see, that he is accused of or identified with a sort of black Gaullism and anti-communist rallying to him, we'll see that he does attract criticism from within Martinique, and one can perhaps understand why. Depending on your reading of that, the other interesting thing about Fit Duval is that the communists, they win that election. This is one of the places, Saint Esprit, that he is re-elected there, and in fact he remains mayor of Saint Esprit until 1981. So that there is a presence of the communists in different parts of Martinique. But I'll just finish with René Ménil, who's, if you are interested in these things, is the best known of the four, because he's been involved in those radical movements and circles going back to the 1930s in Paris, Légitime Défense and things like that. His communist activism predates Césaire's, actually, unlike the others. And he's been a very close collaborator with Césaire, as I mentioned earlier, on the wartime Tropique and then into the post-war years. They're linked through sort of family and friendship networks as well. And Césaire and Ménil, I beg your pardon, is clearly bitterly disillusioned by Césaire's defection. And there's sort of what might, I suppose, seem the sort of high-handed way in which it's announced in 1956. As far as I can see, they don't speak for several years. But Ménil is an interesting character because um, in Césaire's time as a communist, they've just got that party weekly Justice, and they've got some key figures, but there's no real sort of intellectual presence of the Martinican Communist Party, as far as I can see. He tries to establish one with his theoretical and political journal that he edits for several years from 1963 till I think it's 1970. Um, and he writes some acerbic critiques of Césaire and of negritude, the politics of negritude. Um, and you can see, I mean, it's interesting because you can see that on that middle one there, there's the tragedy of King Christophe is actually a play of Césaire's, and that isn't at all hostile because by that time they tried to rebuild bridges, I suppose, because um, neither Césaire, except within Fort-de-France, neither Césaire nor the communists are the beneficiaries of this split between them. They're mutual adversaries, the Gaullists and so on. Um, but he writes the very first issue of Action in 1963. He writes, as I say, this acerbic critique, which is where he does talk about these ideas of Black Gaullism. There's a piece immediately after Césaire's resignation that doesn't, the author isn't named, it's in Justice, The Problem of De-Stalinization and the Cult of Personality. But it's a my guess is it would be by Ménil because you can see the link of some of the same themes, and it's quite cogent, but it uses the sort of themes of the Khrushchev speech but turns them on Césaire, and says actually what we did wrong as communists, we took his celebrity as a shortcut, and look where we've ended up now. We don't, and it is, let's move back to the collective. So Ménil, a really interesting figure. You do see him cited in including recent literature. You wouldn't even know he's a communist in some of them, although he remains a communist as far as I know till his dying day, but certainly till the 1990s. You can read him contributing to Justice and so on. So in his case, it's not so much that we've forgotten him completely, but we don't want to or we tend not to make those links between the communism that he clearly took very seriously. So I'll end there. I don't think I pretend to have done the sort of research that this subject is. It's like to say these are people that open up loads of questions that one would like to know more about and be able to answer better. Um, but I suppose if there were a final point, I got drawn into this topic, which I knew nothing about, by Césaire. And in fact, I am doing, or I do intend doing stuff on Césaire and how he does write history and Césaire and James and so on. But I suppose the point I would make is, as socialist historians, whether we become a little bit too preoccupied with these great figures. We think we don't believe in Carlyle and his great man view of history. Look at the British Library catalogue. You can get about 600 items on Césaire, get about 5 or 6 on even René Ménil. So whether actually, so in a good communist spirit, I offer this as a self-criticism as well. This is how I got into Césaire, and maybe we ought to broaden out to the other people we know a lot less about. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So this is now time for questions and comments. Who wants to go first? The best thing to do is to use the reactions button and do your hand up. If you don't know how to do that, you can wave if your video is on, but otherwise it's difficult to know you want to ask a question. So who wants to go first? Right. While I'm waiting, I can't see anybody. I'll just pursue the issue that I was discussing with Kevin before we started, which is why did he actually support departmentalization and basically the integration of Martinique into France? It wasn't a federal system at all. Was it because he was following the PCF line, which actually believed that the colonies, including Algeria, should remain part of France? Or was it because he actually believed that the Martinicians would be better off by being part of France? Or was it because he was quite pleased about being a member of the National Assembly and therefore part of the central political operation? The sort of sub-question of this is the relationship with Fanon, who obviously took a very different position despite being a pupil of Césaire, who clearly supported independence of colonies, not just in the case of the French West Indies, but clearly in the case of Algeria.
The interesting thing about Césaire is that, so in the 1940s, it's very much as a communist that he supports the whole, he's identified, he's a reporter in the National Assembly on this project of departmentalization. And there's a sense of general disillusionment from how this works out in practice, the place becoming flooded by French functionaries and so on, and a situation becoming in some respects worse than it had been. So that's very much him as a communist. And as far as I can see, the sort of general progression of a sense of disillusionment with that is also shared with the communists in that period. The interesting thing, so obviously he's broken with the PCF by 1956. You can find some people who say that that Césaire was quite an astute political operator, which I can't see myself, because in 1958, the communists, of course, are absolutely opposed to de Gaulle, and across metropolitan France, that isn't peculiar to Martinique. They vote no in the referendum, and the communists in Martinique are moving towards this position of autonomy. But Césaire, he does recommend a yes vote in the referendum. And he says afterwards, and within quite a short period afterwards, I'm like real disappointment, the disillusionment again. And so there is the question of, what is happening there to be so taken in by these assurances that he's had from de Gaulle and Malraux, which are of no value at all. I would say it certainly is the case that he has an instinct that he spends the better part of a year in Haiti in 44, 45. And he does have this view that actually this relationship is one from which Martinique benefits. And I think through his partly through his communist associations, but probably going back further than that, he talks about, he is in some sense got this attachment, which I think many French anti-colonialists have, to some idea of the Republic that they can't actually, it's always there. And he talks about that in an interview with Stuart Hall very near the end of his life. He's talking about how it's different for us, within the French ambit, the French colonies. So what does that mean in terms of Fanon, which I should say I don't know a huge about Fanon, except that I think, he's almost this Césaire, there's these two Aimé Césaire that one can draw on. And I think Fanon is clearly derives something from the discourse on colonialism and so on. But a complete repudiation of Césaire's political practice would be my understanding of it.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Francis King. Francis.
Yeah, thanks, that's absolutely fascinating. I was just wondering, since this stuff is apparently available online, what sort of paper justice was? I mean, is it something which actually is largely focused on what's going on in Martinique, the labour struggles, etc., on the island, or is it very much, if you like, a local bulletin of the PCF? I mean, because I'm trying to get my head around what specifically allowed the Martinican communists to get up to 60% support in elections and that sort of thing. They must have had something going for them. So any clues in justice as to what that was?
I wouldn't say it was so different from other communist papers in the sense that you get a sense. Let me just put in a caveat there. So I've read, not all years are digitized, and I've not looked. I'm talking to years in the 50s that are digitized, a couple of years in the early mid 50s, 56, 57, and the key years for Césaire are. I get a strong sense of they take their political lead. The heavyweight political pieces aren't coming from within Martinique, but it's like, the reporting of the day-to-day activities, which includes cultural affairs and so on. Well, that's coming from within Martinique. And when they're developing a strategy earlier in 56, there has been this Césaire says he's the main architect of it. They do devise a strategy for Martinique. So there are the sort of Congress documents that I would say are a little bit at a higher level than, I don't know, the Lancashire and Cheshire district of the British Communist Party. There is there's that sense of the distinct issues that we address, but not at a very high theoretical level. So that therefore, as I say, I think that possibly comes afterwards when you look at that action. That's what Ménil is trying to do. Well, you don't get anything like that because you're getting quite interesting pieces there. Like, they're ambivalent about Césaire because they see one of the key claims that we have is actually this huge intellectual presence that Martinique has. I mean, I think about this place that it's got a population. I'm sat here in Stockport, about the size of the modern borough of Stockport, and this intellectual life that is there. And well, that's reflected in Action, and you can read these. A mixture of the usual stuff coming from Eastern Europe and so on, but it's definitely there. Well, you can't find that in Césaire's time. So it's a sort of agitational paper, and with the stuff that comes from other sources.
Thanks, Kevin. Steve Cushion, you're next.
You mentioned that he knew Leopold Senghor, and he left the French Socialist Party slightly earlier. But I mean, is there a parallel there, or am I just sort of looking for links where there aren't?
Well, no, there's definite links there. I mean, there's links there in the 30s, obviously, when they're in closer association. And I think there are, if you look at the Véron's biography, those, into the post-war period, they're moving in the same sort of circles. Things like, for example, at the Congress at the Sorbonne in 1956, they're both key figures there. So I think their politics is slightly different. Definitely is the case. And so when you look at Ménil, and he's critiquing negritude, he really makes use of Senghor, because from a sort of communist or a Marxist perspective, there are all sorts of things it's easier to do that in a way with Senghor. But there are I'm thinking like of that Ménil piece. He makes a lot of the fact that they both are influenced by Frobenius, who in some Leo Frobenius, this, what do you call him, a sort of French anthropologist, not French, a German sort of anthropologist, but his idea of historic Africa has a huge influence on this group in the 1930s, but a bit dubious politically, particularly from a Marxist perspective. Well, Césaire and Suzanne Césaire, they write about Frobenius, and Senghor is deeply influenced by some of these slightly more dubious areas of German political and cultural thought. So, no, I think there are definitely parallels there. As I say, I mean, I've not looked at them closely, except you can't miss them. Things, biographies like Véron and so on. They're in dialogue with each other.
Okay, Daniel Stein, you're next.
Sure. So I'm just wondering if you can, a little bit tangentially perhaps to the talk, but if you could just elaborate a little bit on maybe any connections or in mutual influences between what you described as the negritude movement or the cultural movement and the Harlem Renaissance, if you can.
I can to a limited. Well, I mean, because it's just what I've read in the stuff that's about Césaire. So he definitely is influenced. One of the questions that has interested me is how easily or not does he read English? Because so, for example, Claude Mackay and his novel Banjo, it said that he could recite whole paragraphs off by heart, which it appears in a French translation. So it may have been. Uh, I'm not sure if he read that much English. I've thought about it a lot with regard to C.L.R. James, because I've wondered, does he read The Black Jacobins before it's translated into French in the late 1940s? And I can't see any evidence that he does. Léon Damas, who associated with it, does. But he talks about in a positive way about this sort of North American Harlem Renaissance type influence. They translate material in the 1930s. His first published poem, I hope I've got this right, appears to be a translation of Richard Wright. Although again, there's some question, did he actually do the translation? But he certainly got his name on the translation. So they're aware of that, definitely as a sort of as a source of inspiration. That's about as much as I can say, really. I think except that, as I say, I think that possibly the link with Richard Wright, I think, becomes important in '56. But it's a sort of, it's because of his communist connections during the Cold War, you're constrained actually in your movements and your choices. And so I think we're talking more in terms of the 1930s than after.
Thanks. There's two comments that have come in the chat in terms of the parallels, if there are any, with George Padmore's position, who much earlier sort of left the Communist Party to basically support a Pan-Africanist position. I don't know whether you want to comment on how that relates to Césaire's position.
I wish I could, because I think it's a really interesting. And again, I don't really know how much Césaire is sort of aware of the Anglosphere, and Padmore, I think but there are people here who know much more about this than I do. There's a certain wariness. Is that right about the sort of French, the sort of negritude movements and their ambivalence, the ambivalence of their anti-colonialism. So I'm not aware of there being direct connections, and parallels with the 1930s. I'm sure there are, but somebody else would talk about them much better than I would.
Okay, thanks. Jeff Brown has put his hand up, who put one of the points in the chat. So Jeff, do you want to come in?
Yes, very quickly. I mean, I think the intention originally is that the 5th Pan-African Congress will actually be held in Paris. And that's not possible. Then it's meant to be London, and it finally winds up in Manchester. It's just really that there is clearly an attempt to broaden Pan-Africanism to include people who are engaged in fighting other empires besides the British, but the French being the sort of clearly the second, the largest of the others. And I'm just wondering, how we can explore this possibility, because it does seem to me that there is this incredible intensity, and I don't know enough about negritude, but it does seem to me the insistence of Padmore and in Manchester, Ras McConnon, insisting on Black leadership. I'm wondering whether that idea of Black leadership and really challenging the idea that we can leave it up to the people based in the metropolitan state, whether that's anything that is reflected in Césaire's negritude.
Okay, there was also a comment in the chat from Metametal Decadem. If do you want to comment on this as well before I bring in Greta, who wanted to speak?
Oh, thank you. No, I was just trying to connect a few dots, basically, on the basis of some reading around Nkrumah. That was all. But I mean, the authority for the for Pan-Africanism obviously is Hakim Mahdi, but I don't know anything which kind of links negritude with the Anglosphere. I mean, there must be. I mean, there must be stuff around. I mean, sort of people have been writing about it. Yeah.
Okay, Greta. You need to unmute.
Is that it?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kevin. That was marvelous. I enjoyed it so much. I only read recently about Aimé Césaire in London Review of Books. I forget now who wrote the article, but it was very good. And I bought the poet book very, very quickly. And what I'm interested in is the social context. I mean, you've talked lots about it. In how far Aimé Césaire's actions, as well as everybody else's at the time, were influenced by the phenomenal event of the 1956 revelations by Khrushchev, the 20th century, whatever, speech he made on Stalin. It was obviously huge, and people are very affected by how the media, obviously Western media and so on, are using events that can put down, socialism and communism and so on, and in how far I can understand Césaire's action to leave the Communist Party. And you did say you feel he's been a communist, he remained a communist, but he became free, and by leaving the Communist Party. But of course, the payment communists got in return was that it was a huge setback for communists all over the world, that this speech was held on such a grand scale, and people got very disappointed and nihilistic all over the world. And so maybe all the group of people you've been talking about were also very heavily influenced by that. Thank you. If you could say a little bit more about
no. So there were a couple of points there. If I take them, well, I'll come to yours in a second, Greta. But just the first point, these questions, honestly, about the so I've come at this, like Jeff, as you know, I'm a historian of communism, so there are people who know a lot more about those links between Pan-Africanism and negritude than I do. The one thing that I would say, I think, is that, so this is specifically in relation to Césaire, is, I mean, one of the things he does that you can see there are things there that could provide. One of the factors that you're moving away from the PCF is he's doing things for Présence Africaine, including he writes an introduction to Daniel Guérin's book on the Caribbean. And his introduction, he's not interested in ideas of Caribbean federation. And my reading of it, he's got much more of a sort of, he's thinking within this sort of French Republican empire and then the liberation of that entity rather than those connections that you're talking about. So this is Césaire. I can't speak more widely. And he has this meeting with James. I mean, I can see Christian's got his hand up there, so I'm not going to even say it because Christian knows a lot more about this than me. But when they, as far as I can see, as far as I know, that they don't actually exchange ideas until Cuba several years later. So, but that's all I can say on that. On the question, I mean, Césaire and communism in '56. I think it depends on one's evaluation of Césaire, because when he breaks in that at September, I mean, he says afterwards, I know I was breaking with the French party, not with the Martinican party, and then they went straight ahead and expelled me, which you can see is, if you just, it's an entirely predictable thing, but it's as if there was going to be a space for a communism that would, that when he's saying he wants a communism or a Marxism for black peoples and so on, that's what it's as if it was some sort of renewal of the communist project in some way or other. But the whole logic of the situation, there's got a dynamic. If that is his intention, it takes him away from it, as far as I can see, very quickly, because he hasn't got a party. He's been rejected by the majority of those closest to him in Martinique. But at the same time, this is 1956, where there's the attacks on the PCF offices in Paris and so on. He draws to him traditionally anti-communist elements who have course, and he ends up with his own particular type of coalition, probably beyond his control. So there's a logic to that this sort of independent communist position, I think it's got no credibility at all. Very, very quickly, I think that's obvious. And then you can see 1958, it's symbolized by this support for the referendum and de Gaulle in '58.
Okay, thanks. Christian.
Yeah. I was just going to say thanks, Kevin, for really great talk. And I didn't realize the Césaire's two Saint Louvertures in English now, so that's really great. I need to. It's a book I've long wanted to read, and so that's fantastic to learn about that. And it's very interesting thinking about that and Black Jacobins, isn't it, together and so on, and thinking how their different politics shapes the Haitian Revolution. And I think, as you say, it's fascinating as well to talk about all the other neglected kind of Haitian, Martinican communists that you talked about. I was just on Pana. I mean, obviously, ever since the 30s, really, I guess, these debates had gone on around French Pan-Africanists and communists and their relationship and so on, and Paris, and there are all sorts of connections between the people like Padmore, but C.L.R. James, and with Francophone Pan-Africanists. But so, and George Lamming was at the Présence Africaine conference there. And so there, even at that 1956 one, even at that event, there's still you've got, as well as people like Richard Wright, you've got people like Lamming. I think Padmore was quite dismissive of Présence Africaine, that conference. I thought there's a quote somewhere, isn't it, where he says something about how these boys just sitting around in cafes talking about culture when there's the Algerian Revolution is going on. Basically, there's people actually fighting colonialism here, and so he didn't, I think he had the opportunity to go. I think he was poorly, but I don't think he was that keen on rushing over and going anyway, Padmore then. But it's interesting to think, through all the connections, Guérin and so on, that you talked about. Césaire would have been aware of, James and Padmore on some level, through people like Damas as well, obviously, and some and their critiques and things. The other thing I suppose is, I was just wondering about, so you said he broke in September 56 or whatever, and then you get the Hungarian Revolution. I just wonder whether the Hungarian Revolution might have prompted his letter to Thorez, which comes like right in the middle of that Hungarian Revolution of October 56. So I wonder whether perhaps the letter was prompted in any way also by the Hungarian Revolution. I'm not sure. I just put that out there, but thanks.
I'm not even sure that it necessarily is. He certainly obviously talks about that in this speech. I talk about the maison du sport, but I think that's almost like why he's at the top of the, he's one of the first to make the break, because I think it's I don't know, it's difficult to figure out. He talks a lot about Hungary and Poland, but I suspect his motivations I suspect he could have lived with the communist movements in terms of, as others did, in terms of what's going on there, if there hadn't been this sort of colonialist relationship that he's detecting within the, the French Communist Party and towards Martinique and so on. But as I say, because we don't have his papers, some of this is conjectural, really. Perhaps we'll never know. One, just on what you say, because it is interesting in terms of relation with James. And you see, I found a thing of Dama that he refers to the Black Jacobins, and he's this in 1939. I mean, he's immediately taken this in, and I suspect that's how Césaire becomes aware of it. I'm not sure he reads English that well himself, but he's getting that via Dama, and then obviously he can read it subsequently in the late 40s. But this is I will email you, Christian, because one of the things that has struck me is it, to me it seems plausible in terms of the timing that actually you've got the Black Jacobins, and then Césaire produces this book, which you can now read in English, which isn't as good as the Black Jacobins, I think one could. But I think, is that what prompts James to think at exactly the same time he's approaching publishers very shortly after, we need a new edition of the Black Jacobins, which he produces. And I just wonder whether it works the other way, that actually, you all know that better than me, why, at that particular point in the 60s, James produces the new edition.
You have second American edition. Yeah. It's prompted by America, I think, as much as anything, that new edition 63, because we've got the civil rights movement in the US and everything going on. And I think there's a market there for the second edition of Black Jacobins in 63 in America. And it's out of print, and people are wanting it and hearing about it and wanting it. And the publishers realize there's a market for it in America. So I think it's probably the events in America that mean there's a second edition in 63.
So they approach him, actually. They approach him.
Yeah, he's not going to say no.
No.
Yeah. No, but I think it's events in America partly, but the main stimulus, and partly, and as well as decolonization, in the sense that now you've got decolonization as a need to think about it in the light of the new developments Cuban Revolution he's excited about as well. But yeah.
There's time for one last question. I saw Greta waving again. Did you want to come back in, Greta?
Is Logie waving?
There's Logie waving as well. Sorry, I can't see everybody. People aren't using the Yep, Logie. Sorry, do come in.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Two things. First of all, Thorez may have been somewhat disoriented by 56. He may have felt that he was treading not so much water as air while falling fast, because there's that story from Henri Lefebvre, according to which Lefebvre went to Thorez about the Khrushchev speech, and Thorez's reaction was, don't worry, in a few months that speech will not have been made. Secondly, and lastly, I have a question about Césaire's wife, Suzanne. Was she in any way ideologically distinctive or creatively distinctive? I'm totally ignorant. Thank you. I thought it was very interesting, by the way.
So on the latter, that's a really interesting question, Logan, in terms of the latter point. So because she publishes at the time of Tropique, I don't know, somebody would have to have read it more closely and better than I to know whether distinctive, but she's writing things about, like, Frobenius, who I mentioned, interesting pieces there. And then I think what happens is that when they go to Paris, she's clearly, it's one of these cases. It's like she sort of disappears in terms of her published presence and so on. And as he becomes this overloaded politician come celebrity figure on the left. So there's probably, in fact, there probably are people working on Césaire as somebody who needs to be recovered. but I don't know of any actual writing as such beyond that period. But you can, I mean, you can, you know, including in English translation, there's things that she writes in Tropique has been pulled together. There's a small book of that material.
Okay, Greta, did you want to say something else, or were you just waving? You're just waving. Okay. Right. Any last questions? So I can't see everybody on the screen at once, and most of you have got your cameras off. Okay. Any final comments, Kevin?
Well, not really. Just thank you for allowing me to talk about these things. I would only say it's not a comment. It's like an advert, really. But this came out. I've got interested in Césaire a little bit, but this specific thing about particularly Césaire in '56 came out of 20th century communism. We've done a couple of issues on a global '56, globalizing and provincializing '56. So this what I've been talking about, most of this material, there's an article that Francis has peer reviewed, I think, for us. But so that will appear in if you look out for 20th century communism later in the year.
Okay, good. I was wanting to know what was coming out of this. Thank you very much, Kevin. Francis, you want to say something about the journal? Unmute, yeah.
Yeah, just to let people know that the journal, and Steve has preempted what I was going to say, has now been put up online, as for those who prefer reading online or whatever. That isn't, I think, any kind of valid excuse for not joining the Socialist History Society. But of course, if you're not in Britain or whatever, given the state of the international post, I wouldn't want you to miss it. Just because it's difficult to get hold of. I don't know whether that nice Mr. Starmer has managed to sort of negotiate something more sensible with the EU, which means that we can send the stuff over without it being surcharged. But I shall wait. I'll wait events. But it's online. But if you join the society, you get the publications in hard copy to be treasured forever on your bookshelves.
Thanks very much, Francis. So, I mean, a lot of you online today are not members of the Socialist History Society. Please join. The downside, of course, of us putting all our talks on available for free and online, and publishing the journal online now, is that many of you get most of our services without actually paying for them. So it would be appreciated if you can join. And joining obviously means you can sort of participate in send stuff in for the Socialist Society newsletter. We also publish 2 occasional publications a year, so we are interested in ideas of further publications and pamphlets. The 2 meetings coming up. The first is Rewilding William Morris on the 17th of June with Dr. Philippa Bennett. That's just gone on the screen for you. And the one after that is on the 16th of September, Martin Shaw on the left and CND. So hope to see you at one or more of those meetings. Thanks to everybody for joining us, and thanks very much to Kevin for an excellent talk and responses to lots of questions. Hope to see you all online soon.
Thank you.